friends! Welcome back to Sewing for Cosplay, episode 2 of the Punk Captain Marvel vest tutorial. In this episode, I'm going to be showing you how to take that duct tape pattern that we made last episode and transfer it onto paper. So let's go! Okay friends, it's time to make the pattern, but before we cut out all of these nifty little pattern pieces, it's time to make the lining pattern piece. So to do that, I'm just going to cut along the shoulder and the side seam and create the lining piece. Now, first of all, do not use your your fabric scissors to cut into this duct tape pattern form. If you've been sewing, you obviously know this, but if you're new, do not use your fabric scissors, please. Now the front piece has this lovely boob bulge in it, so I'm just going to cut along a established pattern line in order to help flatten that out so that the pattern piece will lay as flat as possible. And then I'm going to debulk some of this plastic wrap and then lay it out as flat as possible onto my paper so that I can trace around it. I am currently using wax paper just because I happen to find a whole bunch of it for a good deal. But you can kind of use whatever you want. You can use butcher paper, you can use brown paper. It doesn't really matter, whatever works good for you. Some people use tissue paper. That's a little too flimsy for me. I don't really like tissue paper, but I'm also not really liking wax paper right now because it transfers all of its lines back onto my forearm. So anyway, I'm using wax paper right now. Sometimes I have to double it up because I am plus size, so my pattern pieces are sometimes too large to fit onto just one piece of wax paper, so I sometimes have to tape two together in order to do my pattern pieces. So anyway, you're going to trace around your pattern piece. The only notching I am transferring are the ones at the shoulder. Those are the only ones that I'm really worried about here, and I'm tracing around it, but I'm being kind of generous with those lines. It's okay to make the pattern a little bit larger because it's going to be easier to take that in if you need than it would be to make it larger after you've already cut it out of your fabric. And it also wouldn't be a bad idea to create this out of muslin after you've created your vest to make sure that it actually fits. Now after you've sketched this out, be sure that you are labeling this. You want to label this as your front and back lining, and that it is whatever your cosplay is. And once you are finished, go ahead and just set that aside. I didn't even cut these out until I was finished with my actual pattern for the vest. Okay, so now it's time to get started on the actual pattern pieces. Now, I'm going to show you on 3 separate pattern pieces. The first is a really easy piece, the second is a medium difficulty piece, and the third one is a more difficult piece. Now I didn't have any super difficult pieces for this project, but I chose the most difficult piece for the project. Now, the first piece is really simple. It's small, it's flat, it has all straight edges, so you put it down on the piece of wax paper or whatever paper you're using. You're going to trace around it, transfer your notching. Then you're going to mark your seam allowance using a ruler. I chose 1/2 inch. I then regretted this. I really should have used 1/4 inch, but what you use doesn't really matter as long as it fits the project and your comfort level. Now, I say fits the project because this had a lot of small pieces, and smaller pieces require a smaller seam allowance in order to sew. So that's why I regretted choosing 1/2 inch. I ended up having to use a 1/4 inch on a couple of the pieces, so it was kind of jumping back and forth between 2 different seam allowances, which was a little confusing. And then I used my ruler to draw out the seam allowance for this piece, and then also make sure that you're labeling your piece. And then I like to put a check mark on the duct tape piece so that I'm aware that this piece has been finished and I don't accidentally duplicate it. The second pattern piece is slightly more difficult because it's got a curve in it and it didn't lay quite as flat as the first, but the process is exactly the same. except for the curve, you obviously can't use the ruler. So what I would do is I use the ruler to, again, make my seam allowance, but instead of doing just a couple of dots and then connecting the dots with the ruler, I use the ruler to make a whole bunch of dots along the curve, and then I freehand sketch to connect those dots in order to make my seam allowance. That way I can get as close to a, in my case, 1/2 inch seam allowance as I possibly could. And then because this one only had a little bit of waviness at the bottom, I was basically able to keep it flat just using my hand and trace around it. And again, make sure that you are transferring your notches, and you have to transfer those out through the seam allowance as well. Don't leave those inside the seam allowance. Those need to go out through the seam allowance. And make sure that you are transferring all of the labels of the pattern as well. That you're, I like to put the cosplay name, and then I also like to put, the pattern name as well. This last pattern piece was super wavy and really hard to hold flat, so I used some weights. Now, I don't have actual weights, so I used scissors and canned air, but they worked just as well, and it helped get the pattern nice and flat. And then after that, the process is really the same as the first 2 pattern pieces. So you're going to use, this process and get all of your pattern pieces transferred onto the paper of your choice. And I would keep them separated front and back, and you can even keep them separated by color if you would like. And in the next video, I will show you how to go about putting the pattern pieces together, or the process that I use to put them together when you don't have a pattern telling you how to do it, because that's the next hard step. Is when you're making your own pattern, you don't have instructions telling you exactly how to go about doing it. So I will see you guys next time. Bye!